Okay, Bren, warm up. Unique New York. Unique New York. The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. How now, brown cow? How now, brown cow? Bren, how are you doing?
Hey, how you doing? Welcome to episode 24. I think we're on 24. And I'm Brendan. I'm actually recording away from Austin. I'm here visiting my parents in Cambridge, and I am actually sitting with my dad. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Bren. Oh, yeah, I'm Michael, and just hope your community doesn't mind that fact that you've taken those top secret podcast documents away from Austin to your home here in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Yeah, I declassified them on the way home, so
Fantastic.
I think we're good.
Good, we're not in trouble.
But yeah, we're here in Cambridge, and so if it sounds a little different, if it sounds better, that's why. You want to do a little what's on the wrist first before we go into anything?
Yeah, that sounds good, Brennan. I'm fortunate enough to have this beautiful 1976 Tudor snowflake on my wrist, courtesy of Jay, who's sponsoring today's podcast from Austin. Yeah, so thanks, Jay, for this Tudor. I've been wearing it. Actually, we were at the casino the other day at the Encore Casino, I think, Brendan, in Everett, Mass.
Yep,
and
Everett, Mass.
We're running out of cash. Brendan kind of held me back from pawning off the snowflake, Jay. So hopefully you should thank Brendan for that one.
Jay, if you're listening, he was planning to just send you the link afterwards to the store and say, hey, your watch is over here if you were going to ask for it. So you can go buy it. But that's actually funny because so Jay lets you borrow that. I let you borrow my Doxa. Kind of funny. We do things inverted in this house. I guess instead of the fathers passing down watches to their sons, the sons pass watches up to the fathers.
It's fantastic, Brent. I never have to buy another watch. I can just get them from all you guys. Saul, if you're listening, I want your Mings or whatever you have on.
And I'm sporting my Pepsi. I usually like rocking that when I'm traveling. And it was actually funny because we found my mom's Pan Am stewardess memorabilia. So she used to work as a stewardess back in the 70s, back then in Pan Am. And we found her pendant, her offer letter, her first paycheck, and also her certificate of training. And all of these, her colleagues were putting recommendations for her to get promoted and saying all this nice stuff. So I took a few photos of that. That was pretty nice.
Oh, to add on to that Pan Am experience from your mom there, Brent, she's from Malaysia and she had to compete. This is just like in that movie, Catch Me If You Can. She had to compete with a couple hundred other people in Malaysia wanting that job. She got it. And in the local newspaper, she and another girl there, it was like the headlines in the newspaper that they got the Pan Am flight attendant jobs.
And you met her on the airlines, right? That's where you guys met?
Yeah, I was R&R from Vietnam.
Your first class.
I was in. I came. I came to go to Northeastern on a hockey scholarship, and she went to Northeastern because it was probably affordable so we met in the university there.
But not affordable these days.
Not affordable
Costs
these
you
days.
Lexus each year to send a kid there.
Crazy. That's why you guys went to UMass Amherst.
Yes. So speaking of history, and why don't we talk about your ASL, your watch history, how you got into watches? Yeah,
thanks, Brent. My story started probably in fourth grade. My dad got me a Timex. It was a manual wind Timex. I was so excited. I have a watch, and I think it was the second day I had it. I was winding it and overwound it, and it broke. I was so disappointed. And from that moment in time, I hated Timex. They had those John Cameron Swayze commercials, how it could take a licking and keep on ticking. I wanted to go hunt.
Take a fourth grader's.
I wanted to hunt him down and just destroy the guy because I was so upset. And from that moment, I was anti-watch. And I didn't have watches even through high school. All my friends had watches. Everyone had watches back then. I didn't have watches. And it was when I graduated from college, I took my first job in California from Boston here. And I remember going into, I think it was a Dollard, is it called Dollard department stores or something? Dillard, yeah. And I bought a, quartz was the big thing back then. Yeah. So I got a Seiko quartz, more of a dress watch. And I wore that for a while. And then I think the next watch I was LL Bean.
I remember that one.
Yeah.
Watch. I remember that one. Yeah.
And then it was a field watch. And then probably in the 90s, I started, maybe when watches became more on social media, there were a lot of watch forums I started joining, and I really got interested in Seiko Citizen Orient watches because they were affordable. They had the magic of the automatic or mechanical watches. They had some history to them. And I started collecting them like crazy. It must have been about 30 different types. And I was early member of the Seiko Citizen Watch Forum, which was eventually absorbed by Watch You Seek. And I was an early member of Watch You Seek. And, trading these watches constantly. I mean, we're just talking for SKX back then, like $125 or $150 at the most. And then my taste kind of changed over time. I started going more interested in kind of the Swiss-made watches. And then I determined that I started selling off all the Japanese and Asian watches and got more into kind of the Swiss brands. But I think my collection story is basically I'm interested in watches with histories and watches that have a particularly dive, pilot, or field watches, like ones worn in Vietnam, World War II types, the Dirty Dozen type, something with a history, something that people wear, good stories. Like, not so much. I'm not into, though I like it. I love watches in movies, but I'm not drawn to buy a watch because it was in a movie. I'm like a lot of folks like that, but I'd rather have that guy who wore that watch on his, I think he wore a Bremont through his, forget the hike, the climber, but he wore it up through like several of the highest peaks, and he did that in short time period. Everyone's probably knows the name. I forget that off the top of my head.
But you like more of an authentic story, not just a fictional movie story behind a watch. Yeah, that makes sense.
Shout out to the Wrist Cheese podcast. They interviewed a guy who was
we don't shout out. No, I'm just kidding. Those guys are funny.
Yeah, those guys are very good. And they interviewed a friend of theirs, I guess, that they knew. He's a stuntman. And he was talking about the watches he wore on movie sets and actually doing his stunts. And that was impressive. I was more impressed by what he would be on his wrist than any kind of movie star. So I like watches that have a history, that actually did something in that history. And so that's what I'm motivated by. That's my watch story, Brent.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. That was awesome. This is turned up a bit. I think it's a little quiet.
Bren, before I even get going, now, aren't you launching a new Flippers report?
A Flippers report.
Isn't that what you can report on what watches are hot to flip these days? I thought I'd add that as a new segment.
I wish. Yeah. I don't know. I think maybe.
I mean, we're talking Mings. We're talking.
Okay. I do have a Ming coming on the way. Yeah.
Rolexes.
Yeah. My Rolex. Oh yeah. Are you surprised I still have the Pepsi? You actually thought I sold it, right?
Yeah. He does have the Pepsi still.
I'm gonna kill Josh for starting that joke. It doesn't seem to end. So what did you want to get into first? Because today we're going to talk about mostly micro brands, and you wanted to talk a little bit about movements, right?
Yeah, I think and we're kind of talking in this episode about mid-range watches for everyone because that seems to be the most common purchases for most of us. We do get some high-end purchases. Brendan and I always talk about the 3 tiers of watches. The first tier is anything below like $300 or below $500. The second tier is like from $500 to a little wider range, maybe up to $2,500 or even $3,000. And the third tier would be like above $5,000 to maybe $12,000. And then that next tier is something no one's going to be buying. It's the $40,000, $50,000, $80,000 watches. So But in that main tier that we're existing here, I want to talk about movements, because a lot of people, a lot of people listening to this, or our one listener here, probably understands the movements.
It's actually just Jay listening.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. But there are a lot of movements out there, and people get kind of confused. What's a good movement? What's a bad movement? I was trying to do research, Bren, that would help say, yeah, Soletta is better than ETA, or Kinesi is better, is the best movement for that range, or La Joux Pareil is better, or Soprod or STP, and Seiko has the various 4Rs, 6Rs movements, and Mayota's 8 series, 9 series. So those are the main movements, really, that I just mentioned. So what differentiates those movements?
Well, I think the first thing you want to talk about is how ETA is basically the granddaddy of all of them. Started in like the middle of the 19th century by Eterna. They merged with FHF, and then eventually with ASWAG and SSIH, the Swatch group. And they supplied a lot of their movements to many different brands. They're known as an EBOC, watch movement manufacturer. And I think they really have their hands in a lot of brands' history. I mean, even if you look at Omega, some of the Omega, which is obviously owned by Swatch, but some of the Omega movements that were made by ETA ended up going and being made into like an Omega 2500 series or whatever. So, I mean, ETA is, and then you have Solita, who is, they basically make a clone out of ETA. So I would consider ETA to be the grandfather of all these, the watch movement world. But
yeah, the DNA of the architecture of ETA seems to then live out through Solita and all the rest. And and you're right. I think some big brands were reliant on ETA. Wasn't like Tudor using ETAs, and then now they're the Kinesi movement.
Yeah. So around 2010. Tudor started developing their a project to make their own movements, and in 2015 they actually announced their new caliber, and they borrowed a lot from the Rolex technology. So they had a full balance bridge, silicon hairspring, and so they actually this project, this company called Kinesi really supplies movements to Tudor, Breitling, Chanel, and Norcane. Kangang, baby. So, and it's a nice looking movement. I think each company, they differentiate it by putting a different rotor on it. And I think the Norcane doesn't have the silicon hairspring. I think the other ones do. But it was actually in a lot of, with Tudor watches, I think it won a few Grand Prix of Horology awards over the years. So, it's a celebrated movement. I think it's something to keep, your eyes on. I think it's going to be more used throughout more luxury brands maybe going forward.
Yeah, I think you're talking about materials and everything. So some differentiators, just to level set things. Typically, I mentioned those Miyota and Seiko style movements for this mid range. They have a larger tolerance, I think, Brendan. They have a plus minus 20 seconds for those movements out there. Whereas the Swiss ones in that mid range have a tighter tolerance. It seems plus or minus 12 seconds for those. Yeah. So right off the bat, there's a performance difference, accuracy difference between the two, and but then there are other things to consider, like the type of materials. Talk about silicon balance spring. What's the power reserve? Can that movement hack? Basically, stop the second hand for accurate time setting. Are there complications that are interesting, like dates and alarms, power reserve, GMT? Is it shock proof, shock resistant? And is it anti-magnetic? That seems to be really important from from your phone, and computers have magnets in them for all the speakers. So, they're really, your watch is always at risk at being magnetized.
Yeah.
So the number of jewels, and just the overall workmanship of the movement. You have like Geneva stripes and perlage and heat blued hands and screws. So if you look at the movement, so consider those characteristics when you're thinking about trying to price something. Is this worth the price? is a $500 Hamilton with an ETA movement and a pretty good power reserve of 80 hours, say, better than maybe we'll be talking about the microbrands, but a microbrand movement with a Seiko NH35A movement. So at about the same price.
Yeah.
So that's the movement, and then maybe the materials are different. But this is giving you a bit of a point to judge different watches from.
Yeah, that makes sense. Always look at the guts of the watch. You're buying something functional, mechanical. You're not just buying something like jewelry that looks good on your wrist, right? There's actually something ticking in there. So
yeah, because we're always at that point where I always hear people comment on like watches seek, $1,200, and that thing has a an NH35A movement in it, or sometimes it can be significant to know this because you might be paying $1,000 and it's a some kind of Chinese movement, or maybe it's a lower end Miyota movement, an 8 series. I see that often in microbrands. They have that rattler, that 8 series Miyota movement is very noisy, and it's the specs are not too tight on that, but it does. But then it's 9015 Miyota movement's much better. It's a higher beat. And
so, yeah, to your point, I think it's really important to be looking at these movements when you're looking at microbrands, right? Because microbrands oftentimes are not going to have in-house movements. They're going to be using Sellita, most likely, or Miyota movements, or some kind of partnership that they have with another watch movement manufacturer. So I think maybe that's a good segue into microbrands. Right?
Yeah, it is. And I think microbrands today really are covering this new middle range of watches we were talking about, from $500 maybe to up to $3,000 even. In microbrands, I was reading that there's a definition that microbrands typically produce like 300 to 3,000 watches a year. Some of the microbrands that we all know, there are many out there. Some of them seem to be based on a rebooted brand name, like Aqua Star.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because we have, in your category of microbrands, there's all these different subgenres of what a microbrand is, right? So you have what you were talking about, the history reboot. So that would be like Vertex, Aquastar, maybe Doxa. I don't know if they are defined as a microbrand anymore. But
Arain is another one.
Arain. Those are all history
Nevada
inspired.
Gretchen.
Okay.
Yeah, Ben Ross.
Okay. And then you have ones that are kind of, brand new ideas that are, and then
like Formex.
Formex in the 90s. Yeah, they came out kind of nowhere with like their new technology of the suspension system in the case. You have brands like Autodromo, even brands like Unamatic. I mean, even in our own backyard, Dufresne. I mean, these are all kind of like new brands that just have new ideas, maybe new designs. And then you have another class of microbrands that would, I don't know, I guess you would classify them as they're like hyped brands, right? They have either someone behind them that is impressive, or they do something with the watch that's impressive. So I think of brands like Ming and Corono, where Corono, you have Hajime behind it, who's an ACHI watch maker member, and so he's very prestigious watchmaker that's behind his own company, although he doesn't make the watches himself. He's behind the brand, right? So there was like this big hype around that, especially because when he first started selling them, they were kind of sold, I think, in the TikTok or Tic Tac stores.
Yeah, Tic Tac.
And it was like kind of like you could buy it like off the shelf, like a Seiko. So people were going nuts over that. But then with Ming, I think it's more of like the design. It's so unique. It's so different. And they actually have a partnership with Etienne, or Schwartz Etienne, the Swiss watchmaking manufacturer. So they have, they're differentiating themselves a little bit, because they're not just using the typical movement. They're not just the typical design. So I think that's why there's those hype micro brands. And I honestly think of it like bands, you know, like you have all these bands, most of them are doing the same thing, but the ones that are hyped or sticking out, they end up going places.
Yeah, there's also what I call the watch luthiers, Brennan.
Yeah.
You know, Brennan and I also are into guitars, and they have these individual makers. You know, Martin is the big, say, acoustic guitar maker, but they have these individual makers, handmade guitars selling for 20, 30, or even more, thousands of dollars. And it's kind of like the equivalent in the watch world. You have these individual watchmakers by hand do everything and have really beautiful complications, unique pieces, which sell like over $100,000. So, but we're not talking about those, even though they might technically qualify as a micro brand, but again, micro brands, low volume, and also a price range between 500.
That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. So those two.
And it's not handmade, custom, bespoke type of watch.
Right. So we're not in that, but yeah, there's a new middle ground too. I think one thing I noticed was, you know, that the micro brands are really, when they came on the scene in the early 2000s, they had social media to help them out. You know, they didn't need to have storefronts, and they didn't have to pay for advertising. There were, you know, a lot of communication of their brand through social media sites and everything. So they really have kind of picked up and helped in that middle ground space. Whereas, like, I think it's like brands that could have been affordable to folks back in the 80s and 90s, like Breitling, Panera, Omega, and even Rolex.
Panera Bread?
Yeah,
Panerai? Panera Bread? Damn, when did they start making watches made out of bread? Okay.
You can eat the watch. But for a case in point, back in like when your brother was born in 1986, I could have celebrated his birth by buying a GMT Master reference 1675 for $1,450.
Oh.
And in today's prices, adjusted for inflation, 2022, that would be $3,900.
Yeah, it's way above that.
So
it's actually way above that.
So your current GMT Master reference 126710 is crossing that 10,000 mark now. So a lot of these brands that were available, Panera Bread brand and Breitling and Omega, they really shifted in price range, and filling that is the micro brand range. And I have to say Seiko's still there, and a lot of the Swatch brands, other Swatch companies apart from Omega, have stayed steady, like Hamilton, Mito.
And Hamilton just came out with that kind of cool textured dialed military pilot watch just like today, right? That's kind of cool. It's like for $1,200 and you get like looks like some enameling, but probably not. It's just a nice textured dial.
Yeah. So Hamilton and Mito, Certina, Longines, they stay, that range is still affordable for that mid-range of watch buyers.
So how would you define a micro brand then? I noticed you define it in a few ways, but why don't you just restate how you would define what a micro brand is? Yeah, so it would be I'm thinking a price range definitely under $3,000, probably between $500 and $2,500. So their catalog is mostly filling that.
Yeah,
that price range. Okay.
and I mentioned about a production of maybe $300 to $2,000. Mm-hmm. So that would exclude your luthier, your watch luthier, who's probably just making about $5 a year or maybe less.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and
I think that's a pretty simple. I think it actually, because it's such a simple definition, I think it's actually it works in a lot of cases there. Yeah.
So those two characteristics. I think the advantages, Brennan, to the micro brands is, of course, it's pretty obvious, the low cost, no middlemen, no stores or advertising needed. And they seem to be innovative in some of the designs. You know, I remember there's always they always started using sapphire sapphire crystals, and people are always complaining, why doesn't Seiko, for that same price, they keep using that Hardlex, mineral crystal? What's going on here? And now you see the brands like Seiko getting into the sapphire. They know that's a differentiator, and people wanting to buy a good quality made watch. So
that's a good segue. It's what what are the advantages that we're getting from microbrands? So the first one right off the bat is you're saying that it's pushing these other kind of old school companies that have been around the block for decades. It's pushing them to deliver more value for the dollar.
Exactly. And materials, specifically like sapphire crystals, titanium cases, and different, some of the design capabilities, like I think was it Formax has replaceable bezels and things of that nature.
Yeah, I know a huge thing right now is like having easy bracelet adjustment and removal from your case without like tools, really. Just using your fingers. So I think that's pretty cool trend that I've been seeing. What other advantages would you say in microbrands? I think for me, one that you mentioned before is just like the low cost. There's no middlemen, right? You're getting rid of the stores. There's maybe even more exacting advertising. You don't see microbrands, filling up billboard signs on the side of the highway like Rolex does and Omega does.
Yeah.
You don't see them like paying celebrities a lot of money to rock their wristwatches. So for me, I think the value is pretty clear cut that you're getting a lot of value for the dollar.
When I see all that advertising and these folks, they basically they're ambassadors. They sign up. That's a turnoff. I think that's a turnoff for. I think for us more watch enthusiasts, maybe that brings in the non-watch enthusiasts more, but that does really add up the costs. All their stores, all that advertising, billboards, and the personalities they have to get on board. So that's a red flag for me as far as on that cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also mentioned it before. Another advantage really is the innovation that these brands are going through. Like we have, you have micro brands like Baltic that are putting out a micro rotor. Right?
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, they're really pushing it. Even Yima, which is a French brand. I actually like a lot of the designs, and they have a good history. They have a little micro rotor too.
Wow.
That they're going to put in. They already started producing their own movements. I'm sure they're not, tooling the parts of the movement. They're probably sourcing all the parts, but they're assembling everything together into their own.
They have their own watchmaking like lab.
They do.
Building and everything.
So yeah, there's a lot, and I classify them. Maybe they might be just on the edge of leaving that micro brand territory, like Doxa. Doxa produces a lot too.
That's something that I wanted to talk about before we get into the disadvantages. But when a brand is doing so well, do you think there's a path for them to become one of the old guard, like to become like one of the top tier watch companies, like maybe internationally known to a certain degree? Like, is there a pathway for them, or is it just you're the top tier micro brand and you're never going to break out of that?
Yeah, I think time is interesting. It's like Bell and Ross when they came around. Was it the early 90s? I think when they first came out, and I was in New York City in Chinatown. I this is when Brendan was either in middle school or entering high school. I bought him a fake Bell and Ross pilot watch.
Yeah, I remember that strap broke after like a few weeks of wearing it.
But
it like disintegrated and gave my wrist cancer, I think.
But it was but I thought Bell and Ross had a history. I was really I thought, this watch goes back into close World War II days or something, and I didn't realize they're fairly new, and so I can see the same
marketing.
Yeah, I guess so, but I can see it doesn't take too long for a brand. If that brand can hang in there for about 15 years, 20 years, I think they're on their way as being an established brand these days. Like Baltic would be a good example. They produce great stuff. They have their own kind of, I was going to say their own design language, perhaps, but it's definitely based on a heritage kind of look to their watches. But to your point, Bren, I think they will become more mainstream, I guess, over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the markers for that, like, because you think about how do you determine if a microbrand is like progressing beyond its its borders, right? I think one of the markers is having their watches in stores, in physical like jeweler stores. I know Zodiac is owned by Fossil, but they have a pattern of having their watches in different dealers, like authorized dealers throughout the world, and I think they're trying to get like a core set into a more expected core set into a bunch of these stores. So I think I don't know if that's a marker or indicator of success, but I feel like it would be.
Yeah. Well, brands like Zodiac, and there are a few others that have a big company behind them these days. And it kind of reminds me of like those beer companies like Budweiser buying Blue Moon or something. And people look at Blue Moon as a
Coke buying Topo Chico.
Yeah, this micro brewery. Wow, this is special, but it's owned by this huge conglomerate.
Yeah.
I think that happens in the Swatch space exactly like that. So
maybe that's the future though. You kind of like your band, if you think about the band reference, your band's getting so good, you get signed by a major label and you just get
exactly
bought out, right?
like Zodiac came back to life. I could see some of those other players. Doxa, the Synchron group owns Doxa. I think maybe that's going to happen like in the beer world. Some of these
going to round them all up. Just own all the micro brands.
Maybe Swatch Group eventually buys Baltic, and once it gets to be a certain size and success.
Okay,
that's an interesting pathway for those.
So let's talk about the disadvantages of micro brands.
Yeah, so we have a few here, like support. I just recently bought Aquastar watch. I really like Aquastar. It really came out, it was a reborn old brand.
I still have a positive outlook on them. That's funny because I've heard nothing but horror stories from you and someone else, Jeff, in the group. And you guys did not have, out of the two people that bought Aquastars in the group, you guys both had pretty nasty problems with it, which...
Well, I think Jeff's problem is a bit more nasty because it's supposed to be waterproof, water resistant. He had it all sealed up and water got in the case. My problem was the crown. When I unwind, it was hard to unwind the crown to wind it, and it wouldn't wind the hand or wouldn't turn the hands counterclockwise when I needed to do that.
Yeah, I would just send it back.
But
send that guy back to the chef.
Yeah, so there's a support issue there. That's probably under a QC issue, quality control issue, because maybe they outsource QC for their watches because they're such a small place. But the support, maybe it's a staffing issue because sometimes it's hard to get replies. I'm not picking on Aquastar. Rick Marai, who did wonders at Doxa, and he's now taking over the reins at Aquastar. And I think it's Aquastar is a good watch. I really like it. They use for their chronographs leisure per movements, and I just love the design, and so I'm willing, I guess people like myself are willing to put some of the issues that come about from a micro brand.
Okay.
But,
so a little more QC issues that might come by. Support is all basically online. You can't, there's no like authorized dealer that you can walk into and say, hey, just take care of this for me. It's all pretty much online concierge.
Yeah, it gets a little complicated where, if you do
if it's international,
getting it sent out somewhere, do you send it back overseas or to Florida?
I feel like they usually have those intake locations in Florida. Yeah, they just take it from Florida and send it off. Another thing I would say is availability, like in-person sales is not something you can experience. You actually have to travel to like wind up,
exactly.
where they'll have like a bunch of watches, and so you have, unless you live in San Francisco, Chicago, or New York City, you're gonna have to travel to like try before you buy. And like I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure that these micro brands have return policies, probably some better than others, but it is still a pain. You have to buy something, you get it, you try it on, you don't like it, you have to go through the hassle of returning it. It's probably, you don't want to do that, right? So
maybe a tip for the micro brands is maybe they should have more pop-up experiences where they they can go to major cities and communicate to this through social media. Hey, we're going to be in Boston. We're going to be showing all our watches here for like 2 weeks. We have rented the space. And
I want to say Oris did that. For some reason, in the back of my mind, we'll have to look that up, but I feel like Oris did something like that. But yeah, I know that the Warby Parker model is where they take that van around and they drive it around each city and say, hey, try on the glasses, Yeah. I think like if Worn and Wound did that with like a bunch of, other brands' watches.
Wow, that's a great idea, Bren.
And then each brand would pay into that service to pay for it. Like, hey, do this tour for me. But, the thing about Wind Up is that the people behind those companies, they like being there and having the actual face behind the brand to talk about their own watches, where I don't know if they would trust other people to do that.
I think Zaosh from Worn and Wound.
I think it's French. Za
from Wind Up from Worn and Wound. You just gave him a great idea. He'll be driving the van around. For him.
Me and Jay will go around.
Yeah, with a Wind Up van with all the different watches.
Just expense everything.
Going to all the
We'll only stay at the Ritz.
But yeah, so other problems, I think, if you're collecting stuff, I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in history, something about the watch that has history, or maybe even current day it's in use, like a stuntman is using it, or it's been on some great adventures and it's survived. So some of these brands don't have that history.
Yeah.
Some do, like the rebooted ones have that history, but a lot don't. Like, but the ones that do have the history, like Air Rain is producing some new models, and based on old designs. Ben Ross has a great military watch, the Vertex. They have these established ones with already built-in history, even though they're reborn brands. Those are attractive to me. But other people who are into new design, like Formex and maybe
Autodromo, Dufresne,
all those,
Corono,
But for me, I guess I'm more leaning towards like a historical and some of these traditional designs.
Okay.
But there is a lack of history that maybe doesn't attract me to some of these brands, because I want some history there.
Okay.
Maybe that'll build for them.
Eventually it will build. I mean, they all have to start somewhere, right? So I totally get it. If you're into history and you're into the history of watches, then there's a section of micro brands that may not be for you. But I actually like all the ones that I just mentioned. I like them because they're so different. I like that they don't have a history. I like that they're new and they're kind of pushing the design boundaries of what a watch is. But
young guy, old guy.
Yeah, there you go.
The differences. The other thing is, I'm thinking that maybe the resale value.
The resale value, I think, definitely a big disadvantage for most micro brands. Some of them, like the hyped ones, obviously you have some benefit there, but most of them, when you go to sell it, no one knows. There's no recognizability on that brand, right? So people really are not going to pay top dollar for it. You're going to get like 50% what you paid.
Yeah, so future podcast, Bren, I recommend the flipping report.
The flipping report.
Yeah.
But for me, I'll just talk about how much money I lost selling watches.
And also, one last thing about the disadvantage, sometimes, these really small micro brands, and I don't think they have failed people too much in the what do you call it?
Servicing?
No, when they're
delivery,
trying to get money to create their
the Kickstarter stuff.
Sorry, older guy, memory problem here. But Kickstarter, I mean, most people usually from what I've read, they've come through for most.
By the way, I just have to say this. My mom's been calling Dad Joe Biden because he keeps on doing the memory problem thing.
I enjoy walking like him now to really. Go into character.
What were you saying? You're saying that the Kickstarter.
You're trying to test my memory.
Yeah, trying to test your memory.
I think that they're pretty reliable. Like, people will get their watch eventually, but a lot of these watches you're going to wait for months. I waited many months for my Aquastar.
Yeah,
but I trusted that they were going to come through because they did have the backing of Synchron. No, Synchron. Is it?
I don't know.
Yeah, is
I
it
don't know
Synchron
Aquastar that well.
on Aquastar? Or is that just
we'll figure that out. We'll put it in the show notes.
I'm doing Joe Biden again.
He's doing Joe Biden, folks. Joe Biden.
So, but then you do worry if they're going to be here today and gone tomorrow, type of thing.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm not sure. Looking back at some of the micro brands, which ones have already kind of died an early death.
Well, and that the service, long-term service too, not even just resale, or people withholding the product from you when you buy it from them, but long-term, you buy a watch, if it's a Solita or a Solita, I always say those wrong.
I guess I had you saying it wrong.
Yeah, you kept on saying it wrong, so now I'm saying it wrong. Panera, shit, Panera bread.
Banbridge.
Jesus Christ. Bainbridge instead of Benbridge. Bainbridge, huh?
Okay.
No, that's how you say it. But now I even lost my train of thought. I was going to say that long term, you are not going to be able to have service parts for those micro brands if they use like custom parts. So if you look at like Ming, right, their sapphire crystal is etched on the underside with lume, and their like their indices, their chapter ring is basically on their sapphire crystal. So if you like crack that somehow and Ming was no longer there, you would have like chapter ringless watch going forward, because you'd have to find some aftermarket sapphire crystal.
Yeah,
so
that's a great point.
Think about.
A bit of a cost or a risk that you take with some of the innovation.
So if you're risky, only buy micro brands. Actually, I would advise people to buy micro brands. If you really like them, buy them new if you want to support the brand. But if you're looking financially, to always buy used, because you're always gonna take a hit if you buy it new, unless it's one of those hype brands. But if you want to support the brand, you met the person behind it and wind up, definitely, if you have the cash, support them if you want.
Yeah, speaking of collecting brand, I thought there's a little thing I wanted to add here towards this end of this discussion, and that's the future of collecting, the collecting market. It's something I noted to you before, that when I was in the 90s looking to get vintage pieces, the vintage pieces were in really rough shape back then, because you have to think of the way watches were worn by people. A person would buy one watch, wear it their whole life, wear it all the time, doing everything. So they took a beating. So people into vintage watches in the 80s and 90s got really bad examples of watches.
Yeah.
But today and going forward, I think the vintage watches are going to be great, because people who have watches today are typically watch lovers. They have many watches. They take care of their watches. So in the year 2030, when you're looking for a vintage Rolex from the late 90s or early 2000s, it's going to be in pristine condition. So it's going forward, I think the vintage market's going to be really, really interesting. So that's a little off the micro brand area, but more into the collecting area.
Okay. Well, let's close it out with an ASMR. I just got reunited with my Doxa, so I'm going to do that one.
Okay, and I got the... Oh.
That's
I got the
fit.
friction
you're not gonna hear
bezel,
the tutor.
so you're hearing nothing. Sweet sound. Sounds like expensive.
How now, brown cow. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Take it easy.
Thanks, Bren. Thanks, guys.